Hi everybody, welcome to Saturday Live at the Backyard Bird Center. Today's topic is one of the most popular family or groups of birds out there, and that are the woodpeckers. There's lots of questions about woodpeckers all the time, and I've done videos before. I did one on woodpecker damage, about how to discourage them from hitting on your house, and we'll put a link to that up here hopefully, or down below, one of the two if you want to check that out. But today's really we're just talking about woodpeckers and their incredible adaptations, and I'm going to go through the most common woodpeckers that we have here in Missouri. But some of the questions that we get about woodpeckers are things like, well, why do they hit on my gutters, or why do they hammer on my house, or why do they hammer on trees even, and how do they do that without getting a headache? I mean, man, they're hitting that trees awful hard, and just questions like that. So I thought I would go over some of my favorite facts about woodpeckers, and then, like I said, we'll go over some of the ID tips of it. So one of the great things, I'm going to start with the feet of woodpeckers, because, and I had a great picture here. Where is it? Well, most songbirds, most perching birds, when you think of birds, you think of 3 toes forward and 1 toe back, and that's for wrapping around limbs, and that's so that they can hold on to limbs and not fall off when they're asleep at night, and also when they're perching and resting and digesting their food and things like that. Well, woodpeckers have 2 toes forward and 2 toes back. It's called zygodactyl, and that is for their leverage, for being able to cling to the side of a tree. It's much more advantageous gripping power-wise and stability-wise for them to have 2 forward and 2 back and hold on to. It gives them a better anchor for when they have to hammer and chisel into wood. So kind of interesting, zygodactyl feet. And another adaptation of woodpeckers are their tail feathers. Their tail feathers are extra stiff. They're very stout feathers. They don't bend nearly as much as the regular tail feathers of, say, a blue jay or something, because they use their tail feathers as kickstands. That gives them that extra leverage. They got their feet, 2 feet, and then they've got their tail down here, and that gives them good leverage for and the ability to hammer even harder. So this is really cool. Well, okay, they're able to hammer really hard and drill holes in the wood. How in the world do they do that without shaking their brains to death, and getting some kind of a concussion? Now, those adaptations are amazing, and they are far-reaching. There's more than just a simple one. Let me get this back. Okay, so why is my... Oh, there it goes. Kind of froze on me there for a second. All right, well, there's a lot of small details here, and they all add up to help this woodpecker keep from, damaging his brain whenever he's hammering. One is they have especially in very stout bill for hammering. One thing you got to remember too is woodpeckers don't hammer into live trees and the really exceptionally hard wood. They're drilling their holes in dead wood. That's one of the reasons they like people's houses. Whenever they do find that they think it's just the biggest, softest tree in the forest, because they can hammer into it and wood chips fly, so they're not hitting. It's not like hitting a very hard, solid oak tree. Whenever it's alive, they chip into the dead part of the wood. But there's a couple of really cool things about that. When they're chipping wood, their nostrils, which is sitting up here on top of their bill, would get wood chips inside of their nose, their nostrils, if they didn't have specialized feathers that cover their nostrils to keep them wood chips from falling into their nose. That's really just a really cool adaptation. Okay, the other adaptations for not getting a headache. Believe it or not, the bottom bill of most woodpeckers is a little bit longer than the top bill. And what that does is the impact is more on the bottom bill, which dissipates that energy through the jaw and lower than to the brain, where the brain is at upper bill. So that bottom bill hitting does that. And there's also micro fissures, very small fissures in the skull that helps absorb some of it. So literally built-in shock absorbers. But the coolest absolute shock absorber of them all, and it's not super proven, but one of them is believed, is their tongue. Now, most woodpeckers, dart their tongues in and get the food, and they have little barbs on the end of their tongue, or they have sticky saliva to grab those bugs with and bring them out. And some woodpeckers have extra long tongues. Now, the red-bellied woodpecker has an average tongue, and the downy woodpecker has an average tongue. But the flickers, the yellow-shafted flickers, have amazingly large tongues. This guy right here, one of their nicknames is ant birds. It's because you see them on the ground eating ants a lot. They'll find an ant hill and they'll dart that tongue way down into those ant hills and bring it back up. Well, that always leads to the question is, what does that woodpecker do with all of that tongue when it's not extended all the way out and grabbing hold of insects? Because that tongue is actually longer than its bill. So where does that tongue go? Well, woodpeckers have amazing adaptations, and the flicker is the best example we have in this area, and that is that muscle is actually pulled through the back of the throat and actually pulled around the skull, inside of the skin, of course, but above the skull and up onto the top of the head. And the flicker's tongue is so long that it actually wraps around way up to the nostrils. So their tongue comes darting out and back in, darting out and back in. And some believe, and it is that tongue also is a shock absorber, one of the things that helps them from taking so much damage. Now, that's not, again, some of this is really proven, and some of it is just theory, but those long tongues. Now, surprisingly enough, the biggest woodpecker that we have in our area, of course, is the Pileated woodpecker, and it actually has a relatively short tongue. I think this huge bird would have one of these really long tongues, but it doesn't. It actually has a fairly short tongue. So we've got zygodactyl feet, we've got a kickstand tail, we've got an extra long tongue, we've got shock absorbing abilities in their bill and then their skull structure that keeps them and adapt them for this behavior and this lifestyle. Now, what hummingbirds? Listen to me. What woodpeckers do we have in our area? What are the most common ones? Well, not the most common woodpecker in our area, but the pileated is certainly the largest. And they are more common than most people think. They're just fairly secretive. They do require larger tracts of timber. This one picture was actually taken in my backyard in the dead of winter, and my iPad is acting weird. So the pileated woodpecker is in our area. Some people have been lucky enough to have them at their bird feeders. Most of the time, they're just in the woods behind your house and taking advantage of food that's offered up out there. But the most common woodpeckers in our area are definitely the downy woodpecker. It was the smallest woodpecker in our area. Very small bird, and its cousin, the hairy woodpecker, larger, not nearly as common at bird feeders for us, but they look almost identical, and looks can be deceiving. So you have to look much deeper and closer to the pictures, and I've done videos on this where we into depth as to how to tell them apart. But for the most part, know that downy woodpecker has that tiny, short, little stubby bill. It's not nearly as thick as the head of the downy woodpecker. That hairy woodpecker has a whomping bill, a very large bill that is almost as long as his head is thick. And that's one of the first things to look for whenever you see one of these at your bird feeder. My rule of thumb is, if you think it's a hairy woodpecker, then it's a downy. Because downies are much more common, and also we see them all the time. But when you look out there and you see the hairy woodpecker land on your feet, and you go, whoa, he's so big, and you realize, yeah, that's got to be a hairy when it's that big. So that is certainly two of the most common in our area, and probably the most common woodpecker outside of the downy woodpecker is the red-bellied woodpecker. And in this picture, you can actually see the red right down in here where the name comes from. And I know the name is confusing because it's not all red on his head. This is a female. The females have red all the way to the tip of the bill. The females have a break in the top, so you can tell those apart. Woodpeckers are cavity nesters, so they don't have to have a lot of camouflage when it comes to the nesting. Like the males are usually brighter than females in the bird world because the females have to sit on the nest. Well, when you're a female sitting inside of a cavity, you don't have to worry about bright colors and things like that giving yourself away. So there's not a lot of difference between male and females when it comes to woodpeckers. Now, the real red-headed woodpecker we have in our area. Unfortunately, the real red-headed woodpecker we just don't see in urban areas like we used to. The main culprit here is starlings. Starlings run them off of their nest. The red-headed woodpeckers drill the cavity, then usually starlings run them off. And so anymore, when it comes to red-headed woodpeckers, and we've had several reports this year, it's been great, but for the most part, red-headed woodpeckers have found refuge out in the really rural areas. Like I said, when Ruth and I do our breeding bird surveys, we find them nesting in telephone poles, things like that, out in countries and open countrysides where the starlings are not nearly as common. So the red-headed woodpecker, its head is truly all red. So yeah, we have those in our areas as well. So downy, hairy, red-bellied, red-headed, pileated, the flicker. This is a neat picture of a flicker. And yes, even though the flicker doesn't have the name woodpecker in its name, the northern flicker, or yellow-shafted flicker as the form in our area is called, is a big woodpecker. And again, the nickname antbirds, things like that. But we do have, why aren't you clearing up on me? This is a, yeah. For some reason, I think our internet connection is not very good today. It's going in and out. So, and then in the winter, we do have another woodpecker in our area, the yellow-bellied sapsucker. Again, a name that doesn't show up with a woodpecker in its name, but it is a woodpecker. They're not here now. They're off nesting in their native nesting grounds up north of here, mainly in the boreal forest and places like that. But the yellow-bellied sapsucker is here in winter, and we can see those as well. So we've got our most common woodpeckers. We've learned a little bit of facts about them. It was a great idea for a program. I really appreciate that. I want you to send in ideas for future programs. We want to talk about what you want us to talk about. Give us a like, give us a share. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe. And until then, come on, let's talk birds.